Joining me now for more on this topic is environmental justice advocate Kari Fulton, who founded the website checktheweather.net. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about the importance of the COP24 conference. How far does that go in achieving the goals that were laid out in the Paris Climate Accord in 2015?
Well, I think that we need to go a lot further. I think when you have voluntary commitments, that's the real issue, is that in order to mandate it, that's where the next step is, and that's going to be a process. So everybody's not at the table the way they should be.
And it's certainly difficult because even with the voluntary, you have the US still not wanting to commit to it. So once you have this huge economy, the US not committing to it, what really are delegates hoping to achieve this week at the COP24?
I think they're trying to figure out ways that we can solve this crisis while not having the biggest polluter in the world at the table in a real way. I think there's also a question about developing nations, and they're developing. They need oil, they need coal, they need, inexpensive forms of energy. And if we're not thinking about ways that we can push these new, more renewable energies, these cleaner development opportunities into those developing nations, then we're going to have an even larger problem with climate change for the future.
And it's interesting because even in France, ironically, we're seeing this conference happen against the backdrop of riots in France, because when the French president tried to raise fuel taxes in order to reduce carbon emissions, it was met with riots and a lot of people protesting this. So how reflective is that when it comes to the difficulties in trying to actually implement these policies?
I think that's a real big issue that a lot of the people within the climate justice movement and sector within the negotiations are discussing. How do we solve climate change while making sure that those who are hurt first and worse do not carry the brunt of that issue? So when we're talking about reducing carbon emissions through carbon taxes, cap and trade, pulling all these different types of ways, a lot of times what happens is it raises the cost for the everyday consumer. And that's where that rubber kind of meets the road and where people get really frustrated. And we want to figure out new and innovative ways so that the people at the bottom don't have to carry that burden.
Now, there was a lot of enthusiasm back when the Paris Accords were first signed, but we're seeing that global emissions of carbon dioxide reached their highest levels on record. So how is the everyday person seeing the real-time impact of some of these consequences?
Every day, people see it. I think when we talk about the commute that we have to make into cities because we have more urbanization, because people are losing their farmland. You see it because we don't have clean water. You see it because you have droughts. You see it in California where you have these massive wildfires that, are sometimes naturally occurring, but what we're seeing is now they're more intense and now they're increasing. And we used to see them every once in a while. Now it's like every other week. It's a huge fire, huge natural disasters. And if you're trying to save money, that's hard on your pocketbook.
Now, we know that there are some in the U.S. who are still climate deniers, including the U.S. president. So what do you think would be the potential tipping point then?
I think the tipping point for a lot of people is they need to feel it in their own lives and in their own backyards. So when you have conservatives or you have people who are maybe climate deniers and then they see the worst of climate change in their hometowns and in their districts, they start talking about it a little bit differently. They start thinking about where can we get these resources. So unfortunately for some people, they're not going to feel it until they actually literally feel it in their own neighborhoods.
And you would hate to think that it would get to that point. And we've obviously seen some U.S. states and companies still trying to meet some of the goals of the Climate Accord, regardless of what the U.S. government is doing. How far does that go when you have the states and the companies, but you don't have the actual government on board?
Well, what ends up happening is that you start to have these climate apartheids. We're talking about bringing in a Green New Deal into the United States of America, but who is going to benefit from that? And if you have certain states that are not even talking about climate change, do not want to put the resources towards resiliency, do not want to talk about how do we create stronger infrastructure that's ready for climate change, then they're not going to get the benefit. They're also not going to see those jobs that come from bringing in new economies like clean energy into their neighborhoods.
Now, as we look at that U.S. climate report, we know that agriculture is always the first thing that pops up when people think about it, because it seems that the most immediate impact is seen there. Which other sectors, though, could also be exposed?
All kinds of sectors can be exposed. Everything from, we do talk about agriculture, we do talk about parks and recreation. We talk about tourism industries, because if you are going to go to a lovely beach, but there's a hurricane or there's an earthquake, you're not going to be able to do that the same way. We can even talk about things like education. For young women, especially in countries where you're seeing the strongest impacts of climate change already, it's changing the ways that they're able to work in their families. If they have to go further and further to find water, then that's taking away from time that they could be in school, learning and growing.
Certainly valuable to note that. Thank you so much. Always good to have you on. Kari Fulton there, environmental justice advocate.